Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this event at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies in Baltimore. I recognize that some of you might not be in Baltimore, but we're glad to have you joining us. My name is Matt Taylor, and I'm the Protestant scholar here at the ICJS, and I am very excited about this event. We have been in planning for this for months. I am very excited about the podcast that we are talking about and the podcast hosts that we are hosting. So let me do some quick introductions, and then we'll get started. So the two women that you see on your screen here are the co-hosts of the Keeping It 101 podcast, which we'll put that link in the chat. It's the subtitle of the podcast is A Killjoy's Introduction to Religion. And if you've ever sampled it, it is a very funny, but also very insightful podcast that helps to introduce people to the study of religion, to the complexities of religion. I have enjoyed all three of the extant seasons, and they just launched season 4 this last week, right? Mm-hmm. So our two guests are Megan Goodwin, who I'm going to read her title to make sure I get it right. She is the visiting lecturer of religion at Northeastern University and the program director of Sacred Rites, that's WRITES, which does public scholarship on religion. She's also the author just last year of Abusing Religion, Literary Persecution, Sex Scandals, and American Minority Religions. And Ilyse Morgenstein Fuerst is the associate professor in the Department of Religion at the University of Vermont. And she's also associate director of the UVM Humanities Center. And she's the author, she just recently published an edited volume, but she was a solo author in 2017 of Indian Muslim Minorities and the 1857 Rebellion, Religions, Rebels, and Jihad. So we'll be sending out some recommended episodes from the podcast to everyone who signed up for this event. These are curated from Ilyse and Megan, so you know that they're the good ones. If you have questions, if you have things that you'd like to pose to Megan and Ilyse, please put those questions in the chat as we're going along, and we'll have some time at the end for those questions, and we'll try to keep an eye on the chat as we're going through here. So we titled this event, Is Religion Still Relevant Today? And I have listened to your podcast, and I'm guessing I know your answer to that question. So I'm going to pose the question in a slightly different way, actually. So UVM, your school, your employer, Ilyse, last year contemplated closing its religion department, and Megan wrote a sharply worded piece in Religion Dispatches.
I get strident a lot. It's often strident.
So, but the title that you put on that was UVM might be done with religion, but religion's not done with us. And that's also the tagline of your podcast. So you've obviously put a lot of work into creating public scholarship around religion and facilitating people's introduction to religion. Why is religion important today? And why in this particular moment should we be paying special attention to religion?
You want to go, Goodwin? I know, I see your face. You want to give the first answer.
I always want to give the first answer. I know the answer. Call on me. I'm smart. Sure. Well, at this very moment, as we gather together via the internet given to us by Ada Lovelace, I want us to think about how religion shapes things like public health, for example, and the ways that religion in what's now the United States has made space for claims to be made about autonomy versus the public good, and how the coronavirus does not care what your personal convictions are, but the Supreme Court has allowed folks to gather in ways that do not promote public health. So your neighbor might get to cough on you regardless of how you feel about religion. And that frightens me, and that angers me, and those are the spaces where I start doing public scholarship. So that's when I start writing things. So yeah, I want us to think about health. I want us to think about law. I want us to think about education. Because I am friends with Ilyse, definitely want us to think about calendars, and just how, I think your phrase was religion in the floorboards, right? The ways that you don't have to know anything about religion or care anything about religion to have your life shaped by religion. And if we're talking about what's now the United States, to have it shaped by a very specific kind of mainstream, very white Christianity. And I think we are smarter, better, kinder neighbors when we are aware of the world around us and how it gets shaped. And since my expertise is in religion, I want us to pay attention to how religion shapes that world. So that's why I think religion is important. Thank you for calling on me and letting me go first.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that, Megan, and that's pretty thorough, so I won't talk for too long, is that it's shocking to me how little folks want to deal with religion. It feels like this taboo, this politic, this, right? A good dinner party is one that doesn't talk politics or religion at dinner. So do not invite Megan or I to dinner because that is all we talk about.
Correct.
Because as we've said on the pod a lot, religion is politics and politics are religious, especially in the United States, but not only the United States. And so I think we actually don't know much of anything. We don't know much history. We don't know much about conflict. We don't know much about peace processes if we're ignoring religion. We definitely don't understand why people feel included or excluded. And forgive me if I'm getting your name wrong, Grace, who volunteered before the session and said that she and a number, I think 40 faith organizations got together and did a demonstration for Black Lives Matter, and you had moved it from Saturday to Sunday so that Jewish synagogues could also participate. I want to applaud you on that. I live in a community that repeatedly said no thank you to that they would consistently hold, I'm not joking you, interfaith action network meetings on Saturday and have Orthodox and more conservative Jews say, we can't do that. It's Shabbat. And folks would be like, well, it's hard to schedule on Sunday. It's hard to make it make sense. And so even in interfaith communities, even in folks who label themselves progressives or activists or good neighbors or wanting to sort of live in an ecumenical worldview, you still see folks prioritizing their own traditions, contributing to the exclusion of others. And so I think for Megan and I, it's education is power, first and foremost. If you miss it, then you're missing a really important story, particularly in the United States. And when you know better, that's when you can do better. And so we take that seriously. How do we get more folks to know better?
Yeah. Right. And not coming from a place of blaming anyone for not knowing better, because the American public school system does not teach religion as a humanities subject. Right. So, I mean, in my darker moments, I want to think about how and who benefits from not getting us to think critically about religion. But in this warm, happy space of everybody being on the team of we do need to think about religion and care about it, I am just hoping that our work contributes to folks who maybe didn't have the opportunity to study religion the way that we have, to be able to access some of the things that we've curated.
So tell me the story of Keeping It 101 and kind of the impulse behind it and the process by which it came to be, because your personality so much come through on the podcast, and clearly you are deeply invested in this project. But I don't know if on the podcast you ever kind of narrated the process by which it came to be. So what's the backstory there?
I'm going to speak to you every time, but
I know you do it.
Okay.
You do it.
Well, first and foremost, we think we're funny.
We are funny.
So
you are.
As failed comedians, we needed
I do
an
2
outlet.
shows a week.
Well, exactly. we are
captive audience.
We are failed comedians because we are professors. So we have a captive audience. Students laugh at our jokes because they sort of assume that their grades depend on it. And, here or there. I'm kidding. No one fails for not laughing at my jokes. So
no one laughs at my jokes. It's like I laugh.
But when we really thought that we had a thing. If you've seen us and if you've heard us, if you see us right now, we've got this shtick to draw on the publicized Yiddish. And so we really thought, everyone and their mother has a podcast. It's like you turn a certain age and you get bangs and a podcast, and I did both. And we sort of thought we could do this better than what we're hearing out there, that a lot of the religion, particularly the academic religion podcasts, were interview-based podcasts. And listen, I listen to those podcasts religiously. That's the kind of joke that students have to laugh at to get a good grade. But we didn't think anyone was doing what we would do. So we thought we were unique. But we also, and I say this knowing that my parents are in the room, I really had like anxiety around my first book, that this book needed to be an academic book so that I could get tenure at the University of Vermont. I did not care who read it. I did not care if it had an audience. It just needed to exist because that's the politic of publishing in a tenure track system. Like my dad goes to the public library all the time and my book's not going to be there. So he can read the book that I gift him. And I generously will put my mom in that, but I know my mom's not picking up that book. And, but they might listen to a podcast. And this podcast is actually much more how I talk, how I think, how I teach. It is where I aspire to write. But when we started this pod, I wasn't at that place in my career yet. I wasn't at a place where I could write in this jokey, sometimes caustic, sometimes storytelling mode. And so a podcast felt like a really important way to share information and to create scholarship that wasn't out of the price point of a lot of folks or out of the library access they had or out of their educational reach. When I write like an academic, I don't tell shticky jokes and drop F-bombs every so often.
And the paragraphs are so long.
The paragraphs are so long. And Megan can tell when I've been translating from another language because all
everything's backwards.
Grammar gets backwards.
Terrible.
Those are for other scholars of Islam. They're not for this audience. And I think Megan and I come from places where this audience is as important, if not more important to us ethically and morally as our students are, and certainly more so than our colleagues in some ways. Don't tell our colleagues that.
They're fine. They're nice people sometimes. So all of what Ilyse said, for me, there was also kind of an excitement about the technology piece. I am a neurodivergent person and I love a new project and I love an excuse to learn a new thing. So we had kind of batted this back and forth and I thought, oh, this is great. You know, I'll figure out what the mechanics of putting a podcast together are, and we can offer a training unit in sacred rights, the project that I run with Liz Buchar at Northeastern. And that's just a fun, interesting, and I think important skill set to have. Plus I get to work with Ilyse, whomst I love. And that's super fun. Hooray. And I don't know that I did a whole lot of thinking beyond that, aside from what I am hoping is a radical democratization of knowledge, which I've tried to incorporate into really every piece of my own scholarship. But I think our assumption was we would try this and like, we're funny and it's fun and we'll put together, I don't know, 5 episodes, 10 episodes. Let's see how it feels. There are things we can use in our classes, and then it'll be like a cute thing that we tried. And it turns out that there is rather more of an audience for this conversation than I think we ever imagined. I think we're somewhere between 50 and 55,000.
No, it's 55, and we're closer to 60,000 downloads
Jesus.
now. Yeah.
In our first 18 months, and sure, some of that is, you know, pandemic teaching, and some of that is general pandemic wanting to get out of your own head and learn new stuff. But it really, I do think, speaks to a hunger for more knowledge about religion. And I think because Ilyse and I leaned really heavily on our award-winning teaching skills and also our enthusiasm both for one another and for things we like to think about, it is, I hope it is, inviting and entertaining as well as educational. And I think that really hits a sweet spot for a lot of folks. So it's been remarkable and humbling to hear from listeners who are using our work to structure curricula in the UK, to rethink how screenwriting happens, to help make their workplaces, particularly in like social work and public health, more inclusive. Like that is remarkable and truly feels like a gift for something that really started as kind of a lark, and again, an excuse to just work with my BFF. So yeah, it's pretty great. And I feel really lucky to have had that opportunity, or to still have it, since, again, we're in the middle of season 4 right now.
Yeah.
So, and clearly, as you're talking about there is a hunger and a thirst for understanding religion in new ways, breaking out of, in your most recent episode, the world religions paradigm that has plagued our academic systems for so long. But so you're building religious literacy, and I know, Ilyse, you help direct a religious literacy, is it a certificate program?
Yes.
At UVM?
Created and helped direct.
So how would you assess the state of religious literacy in the United States today? And
it's a big question.
and what do we need to do to bridge into this desire that people have to learn more, but the starting point is, as you've been saying, kind of a lack of understanding of these things.
Okay, so on assessment, I'm not sure how we assess. I think one of the ways we assess are the ways that we keep track of things, right? We're keeping track of anti-religious hate crimes, and they are on an unprecedented rise. So on that metric, we're not doing great. I think we can keep track of laws, right? Where are we seeing anti-Sharia bills still being put before local, state, and federal municipalities? I think there's researchers like Asma Uddin and Brie Lascota's recent report, actually, for the Arthur Vining Davis Foundation and the Aspen Institute, that are looking at programmatic laws. And I know that there are folks diving into like programmatic laws in this way of, what are the laws that we're not seeing? Who's getting custody of kids? Who are we assigning when foster systems are assigning out children? What kinds of religious people are getting them? Is it members of the LDS faith? Is it Muslims? Is it people who are claiming secularity? Why or not is that happening? I think on those metrics, we're failing miserably.
Yeah.
Like, let me not pull punches. We are failing miserably. But I think locally, and where I like to always tell people to go, and this is a runner in the podcast, so I'm sorry if you've heard me say this before, but I'll never stop saying it because it never gets old. It's calendars, for real. Every fall, I am having an argument with the school board about Jewish holidays. Every fall. My district has learned. The district next door has not. This year on Yom Kippur, they have 7 different schools. One school had pictures on Rosh Hashanah day 1. One school had it on Rosh Hashanah day 2. 3 schools had it on Yom Kippur, and they had a mandatory Board of Ed thing for teachers on the first night of Rosh Hashanah. Why? This isn't new. And in the age of an internet, where like this handy dandy rectangle can tell you everybody's holiday and calendar, it's not hard for our local communities, whatever that community is for you. That can be your church, that can be your school. I have young children, so I'm obsessed with school boards. That could be your place of work. That could be your knitting circle, right? What would it look like to say from the jump, we know what Eid is. We're going to do our best not to have a big party on that night, because it might alienate Muslims who either want to be part of this community or who are already part of this community. What would it look like to just name that? Because I think a lot of people are like, yeah, but Jews, if they want that day off, they could just ask for it. You're not wrong. Except that when I don't see my own culture celebrated in a calendar, I have to ask the question, are me and my family welcome here? Am I advocating for something, or is it already accepted by this community? One of those is a welcoming feeling that shows me and demonstrates religious literacy, even if it's just superficial. And one of those is I gotta fight. And that might look like a real fight, like my kid gets marked absent in a way that counts against their absenteeism. And it might look like something more precious, like taking personal days or vacation days to celebrate holidays, but Christians of any walk of faith, including non-practicing ones, automatically get off from the 24th of December through the 1st of January. So for me, religious literacy is always an active question. I do not think as a public we are religiously literate, period. I do think that religious minorities are very religiously literate because they have to be. I have to know when Christmas is because as a Jewish person, my calendar is relevated to that. But I think locally we can make real changes. And I really do think the calendar is the easiest place for me to point that out.
Yes,
Megan, do you have anything to add?
everything Ilyse said, which is my go-to anyway. Ilyse is right, so listen to Ilyse. I mean, I do not have small children. I do spend a lot of time paying attention to and yelling about politics, and I will agree with Ilyse's assessment that we are failing religious literacy miserably in terms of representation in our elected bodies, in terms of protections for vulnerable people. And the piece that I have found both most frustrating and most frightening is watching laws and protections that were instituted specifically to address those vulnerabilities be turned against vulnerable people to shore up white Christian privilege. I actually theorized this in an article for the Journal of the American Academy of Religion as anastrophic law enforcement, watching laws be turned against their intentions. So things like anti-masking laws, which were intended to curtail public Klan rallies, being turned against Muslim women in Georgia. I should say Muslim women who cover in Georgia, because obviously not all Muslim women cover. Just not just that we are failing to know about religion, but that the knowledge that we have gained as a country about religion is being weaponized to, again, shore up the privilege of possibly the most privileged people who have ever walked the earth. That is exhausting and infuriating and just really, really sad. And so I would like for us to have the tools and the vocabulary to recognize that when it's happening. And hopefully, yeah, start making changes at whatever level we have access to.
So one of the things that ICJS exists to do is to facilitate interreligious encounters, and not just encounters with scholars of other religion, but encounters with actual inhabitants of other religions. There is a certain amount of learning that we can do in book learning and reading, but there's a way that people can also gain a sort of toxic literacy about another religion through just book learning, and especially I find around Islam, right? That people learn a lot.
Yeah, there are whole
Islam
industries around it. Yeah,
Indeed.
Just ask Sam Harris.
So what is the role of that interreligious encounter in kind of building religious literacy, and how do we as scholars, how do we as people who care deeply about public knowledge of religion help to encourage and facilitate those kind of encounters that build a different kind of knowledge?
I mean, I think you're right, Matt. In fact, I know you're right, because we know from, decades and decades of studies about organizing and social change that interpersonal interaction is the only thing that moves the window. It's the only thing that moves the ball. We did not get marriage equality for as long as we have it because everyone decided that queer people deserved their full humanity. We got it because a lot of people came out and said, this is who I am. And people who loved them said, well, then I have to rethink how I am in the world. I think that happens in exactly the way that Ilyse is gesturing to, and in ways that we learn about from our colleagues in disability studies. You meet people where they are, and you don't make them ask for accommodations. You show them that they're welcome by doing that thinking for them, by making that space ahead of time, so that they don't have to fight to be there, so that they know that you have already thought about them in their full humanity and are making space for them in these what might feel like very small, but when you are used to not being on the calendar, when you are used to not being thought of, that level of consideration, I think, speaks volumes.
I'll give you a really good example. For me, it's calendars and menus. So I am an active participant in my local synagogue. I have done many, many talks at churches. I have done many, many talks at local Jewish communities. I love when those interfaith things give me a heads up before I get there. So it's as simple as, hey, we're going to have you, it's a Sunday because it's not on Shabbos. It's not Friday night. We're having you on Sunday after our church gathering in the morning. We'd love to have you for lunch. Here's what we will be serving. We are already making a note that we are not serving bacon or other pork products. We are already telling you that there will be no dairy, so that if someone brings like whatever, it's fine, right? You don't need to know the ins and outs of kashrut law or kosher, but when you say that at the jump, then you're not putting it on Jews usually, but Muslims included, to say, hey, can you make sure that your parishioners don't bring like Aunt Fran's ham roast to this event? Because that's stressful. I have been to so many, I've facilitated, right? So I often stand in as a mediator because folks meeting each other where they're at is important, but folks coming in with viscerally horrifying stereotypes about Muslims, which is my job, I'm a professor of Islam, is something that I have earned a reputation in Northern Vermont of being the person that she can sit there and be like, that question was really racist, and I'm going to ask you to rephrase it because I'm not from either of these communities, and so no one's going to yell at me and throw me out. Or they might, but I don't care. Like, good try. The number of times folks have not said that, and then not said, oh, we don't have ham, or not said, oh, we didn't think about the timing of this, or we didn't check the calendar. We did not realize that the whole month of September is a Jewish holiday somehow. And now we're frustrated. And I hear the frustration in these meetings. How am I supposed to know when it's your holiday? How am I supposed to know what you're supposed to eat? Google it, darlings. So for me, the interreligious education piece is understanding privilege. And in this country, it has always been white Christian privilege. And it's about signaling, quite frankly, that you understand. So I think about this in menus. I have little kids. It's one of those things I do with other moms in the before time when you could have play dates. When a kid would come over and you'd say, hey, does your kid have any allergies? I'm asking that other parent. I'm not waiting for the parent to say, my kid has allergies. I'm signaling to the parent, hey, I'm thinking about this. The health and well-being of your child is important to me when they are under my care. So when our communities are meeting, your health and well-being, your spiritual health and well-being is important to us while we're meeting. It's a way of acknowledging difference. It's a way of showing that you've thought about your own privilege, because not thinking about it is privilege. Right? Not having to worry about explaining your dietary needs is a white Christian privilege. So when Muslims or Jews are invited to the table, they are always nervous that there's secret bacon in the potato salad. And that's a real example. There has been more bacon in potato salad at events I've been to than anywhere else.
Yeah.
So for me, it's that stopping before you talk and asking the question of self-reflection, and then showing that you're welcoming. Even if you said, I don't know what's not allowed, I want to make sure that what we're serving at this big gathering is okay. Can you check what we're going to serve? That would even feel like light years ahead. Mm-hmm. And when you start friendly, you usually end friendly. Mm-hmm. But when you start on unequal footing, it doesn't always mean that those encounters of interreligious spaces feel safe to people.
Yeah. I also find, I don't do as much interreligious work as you do, Ilyse, but I do find that this is a conversation that comes up a lot in spaces, both academic, well, really truly academic spaces, because academics love to drink across the board.
Yeah.
And then, so explaining to my colleagues, like, hey, if you want all of the graduate students, if we really are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, if you're having a cocktail hour, you've already excluded a number of religious folks and also just a number of folks from South Asia who do not culturally drink and will not feel comfortable, as well as excluding all of our sober colleagues. And just so small practical things around planning really do, I think, speak volumes.
Yeah, and as an organization that in the before times actually could gather people and have meals, I can attest to the fact that when you're doing anything interreligious, calendars and menus take up way more time than you were expecting, and especially when you're trying to find that interface between halal and kosher. Mm-hmm. And then you have the Christians walk into the room completely oblivious, happy with whatever they've been served. And so, yeah, I do think there's a way that interreligious consumes so much thought around food but then it's such a great part of the kind of gathering and the interaction as well that I
Absolutely. But I mean, rolling up and knowing that you're safe to eat whatever's at the table,
Yeah.
that is the moment of privilege, right? So having the organization of the organizers do some wrangling around that, I think is key.
So in addition to Christians who don't really have to worry about religious concerns around food, typically in America, there's another group, and that's the people who are running away from religion. And they are a fast growing group. This is the quote unquote nuns, N-O-N-E-S, right?
I mean, they think they are, but it's a longer conversation. Anyway, go ahead.
I'll actually let you have that conversation, because there's all this kind of conversation around Pew Research, all these different research firms studying these people who are disaffiliating from religion. And I feel like in some ways the tagline of your show is speaking directly to those folks, right? You may be done with religion, but religion's not done with you. But maybe to frame it in a slightly more positive way, what is it? What is those folks, those disaffiliated, those nuns, what is their space in religious literacy and in public conversations about religion? And what does it look like to include them in that conversation? Because they have not said they don't have an opinion about religion. In fact, they have expressed an opinion about religion. What does it mean to kind of create spaces where they can be participating?
I think any good interfaith, interreligious program needs to take seriously folks who say, I don't want to be nothing. Right? Like that doesn't make sense if you're not doing that, in part because Megan and I think religion is the hegemon, it's the norm here. So even folks who say I'm nothing, they're saying I'm nothing in reference to being religious. Religion is still the default way of being. So I'll say that first. So not taking into account makes no sense. And we know that it makes no sense because like Harvard just hired an atheist chaplain, right? Like a humanist chaplain, and like, you know, the normal players freaked out about it. So we know that there's a there, and we know that they need a seat at the table because aggressive and oppressive monotheisms are aggressive and oppressive to those particular people. And Megan talks a lot about this on the podcast around the Satanic Temple and around like whose religious values and none counts as a value get to count legally. I would gently do the thing that I always do, which is to suggest that people walking away from religion are often not racialized as religious. So the joke I tell, which is a recycled joke from Ahmed Ahmed's bit in like 2004, is that Ahmed cannot be atheist, period, in American society. At the airport, Ahmed is not allowed to be an atheist. He could be like a wine swigging, bacon eating Muslim, former Muslim. He could literally walk up and be like, I have converted to nothing. I have left the faith. The TSA is not going to believe him because Islam has been racialized. We saw this in Germany leading up to the Holocaust around Jews, right? Famously Sigmund Freud, who was like so allergic to Judaism that he put up a Christmas tree.
Not the Christmas tree.
And forbade his children and his wife to use Yiddish in the home or to go to synagogue. He still had to flee Nazi Germany because he was not allowed to be nothing. And I use that example because everyone always responds to Holocaust examples, but I start with Ahmed because that is the gig right now in the United States. So when we say there's this growing population of nuns, Matt, you're exactly right. Megan and I are always arguing with the Pew people. We love them. Some of our friends work for Pew, but at the same time,
friends work for Pew.
but at the same time, the way that they're monitoring who's leaving faiths, it's always about what we call religious voluntarism. Can you opt into religion? And there are very specific religions, Judaism and Islam among them, that opting out is often not allowed by the external forces. Right? Loads of people see my last name and assume Judaism. I might not be a Jew. I happen to be, but I might not be. And that assumption sticks because of the way Judaism has been racialized. So you can tell I'm a little bit itchy about the question about religious nuns, not because I don't think it's important or interesting, but because we're usually talking about white Christians who have left churches, and that's about it. Megan, did you need to add to that?
Well, one, I need the record to show that I was not the one who brought up Satan. One.
That's a rarity for us.
I know. I think all of this is really important. And I also think the space where we get frustrated, both with nuns as a category and the way that Pew collects information, is that the assumptions about what is and isn't religion still really reflect Christian assumptions, white mainstream Christian assumptions about what is and isn't religious. There are any number of atheist Jews. Are they nuns? No, they are Jews. So this is a space where I think we want to challenge ourselves to pay attention to our assumptions, right? Because I'm never going to tell someone who identifies as a nun, no, you're not. We take people seriously when they tell us who they are. We believe them. And at the same time, as an educator about religion, I really, really want you to say to me what that means. If you say, I'm a nun because I don't believe in God, and that means I'm not religious, oh, I have readings for you. I have very many readings for you. I also really want to pay attention to the way that even that category of nuns gets racialized, because Ilyse is right. The folks who identify that way are overwhelmingly white folks of fairly comfortable economic status. But conversations around atheism and secularism are so much richer and so much more complicated than that. And so I want us to be looking about, like, where do Black free thinkers get excluded from this conversation, and how do they get invited in? And that work of including Black free thinkers is a different work than inviting in, like, your yoga class going mom from down the street. And both of those are important. But I think the work of anti-racism and the work of social justice insists that we do more to include the Black free thinkers than yoga mom. I'm bringing up Black free thinkers specifically because our colleague Christopher Cameron does some really amazing work on them, and I encourage you to check him out. He also has a podcast.
Quite good.
Just as everyone does now. So you have both been doing this very public work, I think, for 18 months now. But you've been doing this in the midst of a polarized political environment that often does not welcome female voices that are strong and that are opinionated. What has that been like for you as women? I believe you've mentioned getting some pushback even in the show itself. Can you talk a little bit about that experience of being public female scholars who are speaking about controversial topics, just tell us a little bit about the lived experience of that over the last 18 months.
I want to say out loud that as white women, we get a lot less flack than our colleagues who are Black or brown, and specifically who are Black Muslims. And especially we get less flack than women who wear hijab or some version of modest Islamic dress. So I want to name that out loud before what I say shocks you. But yeah, I mean, there are white nationalists and Nazis and Hindutva trolls in my inbox daily, like every day. And that was less frequent before the podcast, but not absent, because as a Jewish woman with a large mouth who studies Islam, there are quite a lot of Jews who think I'm the wrong sort of person. The only time I've actually had to call the cops on a threat was from a Jewish person who thought I was a race traitor, which was a fun experience. But yeah, I get a lot of hate. I think I get less than you, Megan, in some ways.
No, I don't think that's true at all. I think really? I opt into the hate in the way that you don't get an option about. I know almost always when I'm going to get shit. And I think it's just ambient for you.
Yeah, it's like daily. I get a trickle of hate every day. It goes into a folder called the grievances folder, and it gets trotted out when I go up for tenure, when I have an annual review. It's actually become part of the work that when I talk to my bosses about, like, hey, how's your job this year? And it's like, here's the daily bullshit that I put up with. Sorry, I swore on your podcast. I said I wouldn't do it, and I did it anyway.
In front of your mom.
Yeah, in front of my, they've heard me curse a lot. But like it's actually part of what it means to do the work I do, which is deeply unfortunate. No one joins the academy as a 19th century historian thinking that their daily experience is going to be hate from right-wing Jews, right-wing Hindus, and right-wing Christians. But that's my experience. And Megan, I'm not surprised because we've talked about this, but I'm always curious about how there's a difference between what you and I get. Yours is really responsive. Like you say something loud and then men come in your mentions on Twitter.
Women too. I get a lot of white women who are very angry with me a lot of the time. But I provoke, not deliberately. I am not a troll feeder. But I am also a woman with a large mouth. And I am pretty unapologetic about sharing the inside of my head with the outside world. I don't get a lot of like, you are a race traitor on a daily basis. What I do get are responses to like specific moments, usually through social media. And I don't think ever in response to the podcast so far. I did a lot of thinking out loud about my neighbors during the 2016 election cycle and the fact that they are nice, older, white Mainers who don't have a dog but buy cookies for my dogs and like truly give my dogs birthday cards, and also had a big old honkin' Trump sign out in front of their house for months. And I used some colorful language about whiteness and the folks who enjoy the privilege thereof. And I'm pretty sure, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that series of tweets wound up screenshotted and on Facebook. And so I got a lot of emails, I got a lot of gross stuff on Facebook, and had I but known, I also have a very colorful hate letter that somebody took the trouble of printing out in rainbow colors. It's so pretty, in rainbow colors, that says, I'm gonna quote here, "Fuck you, bitch, for real."
For real, just in case you thought it was a joke.
Parentheses, for real. No. But
the mail is the most disturbing. I get a lot of physical mail, and it's so disturbing because someone put you took the stamps are not cheap.
They are not, and you got
expensive.
Yeah,
and you got to go to the mailbox, and
printers never work. Like, you made an effort. This was not your first draft, anyway. So for me, part of this space where I try to use that privilege that I have of truly not provoking nearly as much hate as you might expect that I get, given the amount of shit that I talk, is insisting that anyone who's calling for scholars to do public work acknowledge the fact that it's not equally safe for all of us, and thinking about places where I can support my more vulnerable colleagues. So I will give you a recent example in which I name names because I am a jerk. So one of my recent fellows in our public scholarship training, Deepa Sundaram, just started a column at Religion News Service talking about her experiences both as a scholar of Hinduism and as a cultural Hindu herself. And I think she's really smart. I think she does great work. She has also been really active in a scholarly pushback against Hindutva, Hindu nationalist attempts to chill academic speech around Hindu nationalism, which has been relentless and overwhelming and truly terrifying. The worst hate mail I've ever seen is not stuff that I personally received, but stuff that one of my colleagues was getting on Twitter, and I took over his handle for the week and just was filing it away so that he didn't have to deal with it. So Deepa and her colleagues released a really helpful manual for what do you have to do in response to this kind of horrible violent hatred. They organized a really smart conference so that colleagues could get together and talk about why this was important. And not only did she receive gut-wrenching, horrific threats and harassment online, but Religion News Service ran an op-ed from the Hindu American Foundation, which is pretty unabashedly Hindu nationalist, basically both siding the issue. And so a space where I tried to use my privilege as someone who both works in public scholarship on religion and has written for Religion News Service, like I have been on their payroll, was to call out both the outlet and the editor-in-chief and say, this is as though you are both sides mattering, Black Lives Matter. And the fact that you all are not religiously literate enough to see the way that you're undermining her scholarly credibility and also putting her and scholars like her in danger is appalling. I can do that because I don't get this on a daily basis, because I am not tenure track, and so I am not vulnerable about promotion in the way that some of my colleagues are. And because my brains being what they are, I don't mind it when people yell at me. But I think we need to see an awful lot more of this, because it can't, as Ilyse pointed out from the very beginning, when we're talking about scholarly vulnerability and public scholarship, it can't just be about like what white ladies are facing, because it is not, it's not a half, it's not a third, it's not even an eighth of it. And so
it's a drop in the bucket.
Even as we need to acknowledge that it happens, that it is part of doing public scholarship, and that we need better responses than just like endless panels about the fact that this happens. It needs to be about uplifting, again, the folks that are more vulnerable than we are, and making sure that we are real material resources and support for them when they're facing this kind of violence.
So I'm going to pose some of the questions from the chat, and it looks like there are three kind of related questions around the intersection of religion, spirituality, and mindfulness. And oftentimes people will, if they're kind of naming themselves nuns, will say, I'm spiritual but not religious, or I practice mindfulness, but it's not a religious thing for me. What do you think about the ways that those these things that sometimes people would say, oh, well, those are synonyms, right? But what do you think about this kind of diversion into other terminology and even practices that emerge from religion, from religious traditions, but that people are trying to kind of remove the religious layer from them and reclaim them in some way?
I think I have nothing against claiming of spirituality, but I think we've said this before, that the spiritual but not religious label is something that is more available to white folks, often white folks who are post some form of Christianity, though sometimes Judaism. And it's what we think of as spiritual practices, and that has a very, very long history, which I won't bore you with, but it has to do with imperialists and Asia, and the ways that Asian religions were classified as philosophies as opposed to religions. So we see quite a lot of this around legitimate, like historic Buddhist practices, but the way that colonizers felt like those practices were portable, translatable, universalizable, versus practices like Islamic dhikr or spiritual practices around Sufism. Those were tribalistic and ethnic. And I want you to see my eyebrows squinching and like disgust. I do not think that. But the history of those phrases is actually quite long. And the way that we still see them playing out in American publics, and certainly in the UK as well, is along those same lines. That flexibility of thinking, what we imagine to be spiritual tends to be Native traditions, Asian traditions, less so African traditions, not because Black folk aren't reclaiming their own traditions and their own histories as spiritual, but because white folk claim spirituality from not Black places. So it's an anti-Blackness within that codification. That doesn't mean that your yoga practice is bad or that your mindfulness app is problematic. It just means that we're more likely to see Buddhism, Hinduism, Native American traditions within that mindfulness practice, but not Jewish meditation practices, which also have a 5,000-year history, or Muslim meditation practices, which also have a 5,000-year history or 3,000-year history.
Yeah, yeah.
Islamic Arabia.
And
Go ahead, sorry, Megan.
No, I'm just agreeing with you, as I always do, except about fonts. I think Ilyse is right to gesture toward the racial implications of whose practices we as white people feel entitled to. So the anti-Blackness of not adopting like African diasporic religions is worth paying attention to. But I only really, really want to pay attention to the impulse to be like, well, yoga is fine. This is not me saying yoga is or is not fine. What I'm interested in are the ways that white folks get mad at the suggestion that it might not 100% be fine. I want to think about the hate mail that my colleagues like Shrina Gandhi and Deepa Sundaram get when they say, hey, this could be cultural appropriation, and can we think about it for a minute? Which I have to say they put in much gentler, much kinder terms than I ever do. Because when I retweet, I use more colorful language and more strident terms. Again, because why even have privilege if you can't yell at other white people? I want us to think about whose practices get commodified, whose stuff gets sold at Sephora. Like I teach a class about witches because I have a cool job. And one of the conversations we have around appropriation is the fact that like we as a country have a history of, until the year I was born, until 1978, of trying to eradicate native quote unquote spiritual practices, right? And now, 40 some odd years later, you've got Sephora selling starter witch kits that have sage that people not much older than I am would have been truly beaten for trying to use as like a cute thing that you can buy at the mall. So when we're having these conversations, particularly around the nuns and like the appropriation conversation, I don't want it to be like, oh, you need to feel bad about this because feelings. Really, it's paying attention to history and historic complicity in violence against marginalized people. And so it's not to say like identifying as a nun or as spiritual but not religious or as mindful is in and of itself harmful. But I really, really want us to be mindful of the places we might be complicit in, however inadvertently, in racism and white supremacy.
Just to add my own anecdote, it's not only out in culture. This actually happens at the university as well. I was a religious studies minor 20 years ago, and I took a Buddhist philosophy class, and the professor comes in, white guy, blonde ponytail, says he's a practicing Buddhist, but he's like, but Buddhism is only a philosophy. It is not a religion. And this is in a public university classroom, right? This is these ideas get perpetuated as well within academia frequently.
Definitely.
Hopefully less so than 20 years ago, but it's still happening.
You have public colleges that throw Diwali celebrations now as like, it's a cute color war thing that we do and not a practice that has, decades and centuries and millennia of history.
All right, I'm going to ask one last maybe depressing question, but so one of the things I really like about your podcast is the way that you never allow religion and power to be disaggregated.
They're not.
And you've done this over the last hour with us as well. And we have a question here about that, the importance of doing that, of holding those things together, but also just the question of is this getting worse, the way that religion and power are getting conflated, or is it just becoming more visible in the culture around us?
God, I hope it's getting more visible. It's also, sorry, I'm going to make it about laws again, but it is also, if we are thinking specifically about protections for religion, it is getting worse. It is getting markedly worse. I have an article that's up on my website if folks are interested, but I did accounting because I don't have enough lawyer friends, so I didn't realize that there are like journals you can check for this. So I truly went through and hand counted the number of Supreme Court cases that have ruled on definitions of free exercise, which is one of 3 constitutional protections that we have around religion in what's now the United States. So free exercise sounds like a thing. It's in the First Amendment. It sounds like a thing that should protect practice of religion. Historically, what it's protected is belief. We were arching toward protecting beliefs and practices of minority religions for quite a long time, till about 1990, actually. And then we see a dramatic and sharp, and I would argue very violent shift toward codifying religion as things that look very specifically like white mainstream Christianity, and both during the Reagan presidency and then sharply through the Obama presidency and since, making sure that protections for religion protect white mainstream Christians. Like those are things you can count. That is getting worse. There are spaces that are trying to make it better. I'm not saying we shouldn't try to make it better, but given the makeup of the current Supreme Court and the reluctance of the current administration to do a goddamn thing about that, it's bad, it's getting worse, and I don't think we've seen the half of it yet. Joy, killed.
Yeah, I'll agree with Megan. I think globally, and this is the project I'm working on allegedly during sabbatical, there's a global shift towards conservatism that's we start seeing in the mid 70s and certainly articulated through the 80s and 90s. And we're seeing the results of that, the generation of that now. We're seeing quite a lot of Islamophobic laws, literally the globe over. 20 years onto the war on terror, right? And 20 years onto US-based foreign aid, in some cases explicitly tied to how are you treating Muslims? Are you profiling them? Are you engaging in surveillance on them? So like across Europe, across Asia, we're seeing really horrific anti-Muslim violences and anti-Muslim laws and practices. And Megan and I are really obsessed with laws because they're an obvious place to see the material consequence of these things. It's not just in the ether where like there's a stereotype about it or maybe bad practices. It's the law of the land. And so you can enforce it and it takes effort to change it.
Yeah.
So that I think is bad. And I don't want to pretend like it isn't.
Yeah, I will also say our colleague Christian Peterson just published a great piece with Al Jazeera English looking at the way that rhetoric and policies around the American war on terror following 9/11 were picked up and have empowered the People's Republic of China to likewise target Uyghur Muslims.
To like literally criminalize Muslims for existing. So I think those
as
things
threats
are,
to domestic security.
So I think those things are, I don't want to, we're killing the joy. That's kind of our thing. You can't ignore that those are things that are happening. And I think for both of us that the knowing is where we start. And so it's a harder battle to fight if people don't understand what's going on. So we really do. And I'm in a space of naming why I think this is ultimately an optimistic as opposed to depressing place to come at it. The news is bad, but that we want to share it with you vociferously and with gusto is about like love of our communities and about expecting people to do better. I actually have deep faith that we can do better. But if you think it's fine, if you're like one of these people who looks at the calendar and is like, it's 2021, that couldn't possibly happen. No.
Yeah.
It's happening worse now than 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And so like for us, I think we see our scholarship and our teaching as like not a rallying cry in the way that the hate lists that I'm on the internet would have you believe, but a rallying cry around like, go learn more, see for yourselves what's going on, and then make a decision about what you want to do about it.
And I think that is, to, I think, quote our colleague Omid Safi, an act of radical love. I mean, for me, it's a very James Baldwin space. The idea that systems are built by humans means that they can be changed by humans, but you can't change anything before you've acknowledged what's happened and that it's wrong, that it's a problem. So hopefully vocabulary, religious literacy, diagnostic tools around where and how things have gotten worse can empower some folks to go out and make changes at whatever level is available to them.
Well, Megan, Ilyse, on behalf of the ICJS and our audience, let me just say thank you for killing our joy.
Anytime.
You've taught us a lot in the last hour, and I think it's just even the model that you have of public scholarship is really inspiring to us, and it's something that we at ICJS aspire to grow in and continue, and we love to have you as partners in that work.